Good evening. If you want to turn your Bibles to 1 Samuel 17, that's where we're going to be spending some time this evening. 1 Samuel 17. There we go. If you're a good Bible student, you know that 1 Samuel 17 is a very famous chapter in the Old Testament because that's David and Goliath. That's the story of David and Goliath. I'm going to ask you a question, though, that has absolutely nothing to do with David and Goliath to have in the back of your mind, because this is the point that I would like to make in this sermon. Why is it such a big deal when we sin? Why is it a bad thing when we sin? Now, that seems like a really basic question. That's something you would answer in a little kids class. But let me be more specific, because there's a side of that question I want to bring out tonight. Why is it then when I, as a Christian, sin in a public way? Why is it when those of us who has accepted Christ as our Savior, been baptized into His name, when we sin in a way that other people can see it, why is that a big deal? There's a lot of answers that you can give to that. Hebrews 10 is a straightforward answer to that. For when we who have accepted, or for when we who sin willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. That's a straightforward answer. But that's not what I want to bring out of this tonight. Why is it that when we who know better, who've accepted Christ, sin in a way that other people can see, why is it such a big deal? Well, have that question in the back of your mind, because tonight we're going to be talking about King David, and particularly two stories of King David. The first one is David and Goliath. The second one, David and Goliath, is the most famous story in the Bible, save for maybe the crucifixion and Jesus' life. So take Jesus out of the Bible. I think David and Goliath is the most famous. You can't escape it. You go to a football game or a basketball game, someone will probably bring up David and Goliath if it's an underdog, or it doesn't matter what it is. If it's a little guy versus a big guy, it's David and Goliath. This story gets brought up all the time. Well, if I asked y'all finish this sentence, David and, I feel like most of y'all would say David and Goliath, but the rest of y'all would probably say David and Bathsheba. And one of y'all, to be a smart aleck, would say David and the time he took a census without permission. But we're not bringing up that story. What I want to talk to you all about tonight is a comparison between David and Goliath and David and Bathsheba. David's highest moment in his reign and David's lowest. I know I said it's the highest moment in his reign. Technically, David is not king yet, but this is the moment that solidifies his crown. I know that God anoints him, or Samuel anoints him for God a chapter beforehand, and that is what God allows him to take the throne. God gives him the throne of Israel and of Judah, he says, in 2 Samuel. But in a worldly sense, David and Goliath is the reason he becomes king. If you remember when Absalom, later in David's reign, when Absalom rebels and takes the throne, when David's trying to rally the men of Israel behind him, he goes and he gets the sword of Goliath. And he has the sword to show. Do you remember back when I slayed the Philistine? Do you remember who I am? David and Goliath? Do you remember that story? Later, when Saul hears the people singing, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. All of that started because of David and Goliath. Let's go through this story. It's going to be very skimming because I'm sure most of us know the story. But starting in verse 1 of chapter 17, now the Philistines gathered their army together to battle. They were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah. And they encamped between Soka and Ezekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of Philistines, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. And then he describes him for a bit, but jumping down to verse 8, it says, Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Okay, so this is the setup. We know the setup. Goliath is challenging Israel, give me a man. We see this man who's incredibly impressive. 6 cubits in a span, depending on how the translations go. Some people will say he was over 6 foot, pushing 7 foot. Other people say he was over 9 feet, pushing 10 feet. It just depends on what translation you want to take with it. I tend to believe the 9-foot one because it makes the story better. When we're getting into this impressive man is coming and defying the armies of Israel. He goes, are you not the servants of Saul? Come out and fight me. Well then, if you know the children's song, the next character to enter is only little boy David, which is a funny way because David was not a little boy at this point. He was probably either late teens, early 20s, so he was somewhere closer to my age than like a little kid. But, song's still great. But David comes out to battle. This has nothing to do with the sermon, but it's a pet peeve of mine because I'm going to bring it up here. Verse 14. Let's start in verse 13, actually. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to battle, and the names of the sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So the obvious thing to point out here is that David's coming from Bethlehem. It's Jesus. Like that's an obvious reference to Jesus here. David's trying to point at David being Jesus here in this story. But the point that I want to bring out is that when I was a kid and I watched the VeggieTales version of this movie with David versus the Giant Pickle, David was not supposed to be at the battle. He snuck there. And I know that's a funny way of bringing that up, but I've heard other people talk about David being at this battle like he wasn't supposed to be there. David was Saul's armor bearer at this point. He was his shield bearer. If you remember in a chapter before, when the Spirit of the Lord left Saul and went to David, and a distressing spirit came upon Saul. And the servant said, let's go find a man who's skillful in music, and that will calm Saul down. And they went and they found David. And David played the lyre for Saul, and it calmed his distressing spirit. Saul made him his armor bearer. So when Saul is out to war, David is going with him. And also, it says that David occasionally went and returned from Saul, meaning he's with Saul. He would return from him and go take care of his father's sheep. I just think it's slanderous to say that David's not supposed to be here, because not only is David supposed to be there, he also is returning home to do chores. That's terrible. If I was a kid, Dad, please, can one of my 8 brothers take care of the sheep while I'm out at war right now? But no, David returns as the good shepherd, and he takes care of his sheep. And evidently, he was with his sheep when Goliath makes this proclamation, so he doesn't hear it till he comes back. And when David comes back where he's supposed to be, he hears the proclamation, and he's angry. And then we know the story proceeds, and David kills Goliath. But what is the motivation that I really want to bring out? Why does David fight Goliath? Let's read what David says here. In verse 22, and David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper and ran to the army, and he came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was a champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. And then all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and will give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. I always thought those rewards were funny. Because as good red-blooded Alabamians down here in a red state, that third one sounds nice. It's so I'm going to make you rich. I'm going to give you my daughter. You're going to be part of the royal family. And also, you don't have to pay taxes. I always got a chuckle out of that. But notice that David does ask about it. And it says right here, In verse 26, then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall it be done for the man who kills the Philistines? So he is asking about it. But what is it that David says here? Why does he go and fight Goliath? Does he say, well, it'd be great to be greatly rich. I wouldn't have to go back and tend my father's sheep. I could hire somebody. Or, oh, I mean, I'm a young man. It'd be great to marry the daughter of the king. That would be a great status. Or even that tax exemption that I'm sure a lot of us would jump at. What is it that promotes David? What is it that's David's reasoning for going out against Goliath? Verse 26 again, then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David doesn't want to fight Goliath because he thinks, like, oh, this is a good time to make a name for David. And this isn't David being uber patriotic. He's like, no, you can't say that about King Saul. You can't say that about Israel. No. David is mad that Goliath is blaspheming. He says it multiple times, too, just to really get the point in. So he says it here. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Later, when Saul calls David to him, because he hears that David wants to challenge Goliath, and Saul's trying to talk him out of it, David then says to him in verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose again against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing that he has defied the armies of the living God. Again, David here talking to King Saul, he doesn't say, Saul, I'm going to do this for you. As your servant, I'm going to go out and fight. Or he doesn't say, Saul, this man won't stand against Israel. Or he won't say, Saul, you don't know how tough I am. I'm going to go out and make a name for myself. What David says is this man will be like that lion and that bear I killed because he has defied the armies of the living God. And then one last time when David goes to Goliath, he explains to Goliath why he's going to do it. And this is some like A+ smack talk here. Like I would have been intimidated by itself. Like imagine Goliath. I always think it's really funny. Goliath is like standing on the field and he sees this like young kid, and I realize he's not that young, but so younger than Goliath, running at him. Goliath gets mad that like this is who Israel sends against me. He even says it here in verse 41. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and before the man he bore a shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. That is such a funny thing for me. That Goliath's like, you just sent out this pretty boy to come and fight. Like, do you think so little of me? He even says here, verse 43, so the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistines cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give you the flesh. I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Like, Goliath is just insulted by this little pretty boy coming out to fight him. But what's interesting is what David says in response. I feel like this alone would have been enough to shock Goliath, because Goliath is not expecting anything out of this little kid. He says here, David says here, starting in verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with the sword and with the spear and with the javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air, the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. David explains straightforward his motivation. David's not doing this for himself. David's not doing this to show who he is. David is doing this because Goliath is blasphemed, and this is an opportunity for David to show all the earth that there is a God in Israel. Okay, that's David and Goliath. Great story. David's hiding. Now let's go to the other side. 2 Samuel 11 is David and Bathsheba. The reason why David and Bathsheba, I think, stands out so much to us, and I think I've brought this up before, is I have a theory that hasn't been proven wrong yet, but I'm not confident enough to publish it. That every character in the Bible, save for one, when you get a lot of details about them, so not someone who's just mentioned in the genealogy, but someone with a story, you'll hear something very good about them, and then also something very bad about them. So you'll hear something great about Abraham, and then you'll hear something very bad about Abraham. You'll see something good about Moses, then something bad about Moses. You'll see something good about David, and then something bad about David. And then you see something good about Jesus, and it's kind of left there to show you that Jesus is the one breaking the pattern of this. And the reason I think David and Bathsheba resonates so much with us is David is one of the best people in the Bible. David is the man after God's own heart. Do you know how hard it is to have a Bible study with a guy named David and a guy named Joshua when you're named Adam? Because David gets to talk about, oh, David's the man after God's own heart. And then Joshua gets to talk about, well, Joshua literally is Jesus. Like those relations are so much. And I'm like, yep, Adam brought sin into the world. So let's not study Romans because that point's obvious. But David is such a great character, and you see so many great things said about him, and then this happens. How can this be the man after God's own heart? And this is not the sermon again, but I'll give you this one for free. I think the reason why David is the man after God's own heart is not because he doesn't sin, but because of how he reacts to sin. How he reacts to other sin, how he reacts to his own sin is what makes him the man after God's own heart. Because David hates sin, but the thing is he gets so wrapped up in it, we see this great fall from grace that he has. Okay, so chapter 11, verse 1. And it happened in the spring of the year, at that time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. If you notice, there's already a parallel here between David and Goliath and David and Bathsheba. The point that I made so obvious about slamming VeggieTales is that David was where he was supposed to be with David and Goliath. He was not only where he was supposed to be, he was at both places he was supposed to be. He was taking care of Saul, then had to run over here and take care of his father's sheep, and ran back and take care of Saul. And he's like bringing gifts. Like his dad was like, hey, take some cheeses for King Saul. And David's like, yeah, great idea. Like David is doing what he's supposed to be doing. A lot of preachers skim over this and they'll say, oh, I don't think it means that much. It says it twice, though, or it really says it 3 times. There's a time when kings go out to battle. David sent Joab. David remained in Jerusalem. Like this verse is just telling you, David is not where he's supposed to be. David should be with his armies, but instead he's at home. And then we know the story. David goes out on his rooftop. He sees Bathsheba bathing, and he brings him to her. Something I want to bring out from this, that's again, not the main point of the sermon, but something to bring out. A lot of preachers condemn Bathsheba harder than I think she should be. And then other preachers forgive her more than I think she should be. I've heard preachers talk about Bathsheba like she's doing like a striptease on her roof here, like trying to seduce David. I've heard preachers say that David pretty much raped Bathsheba. I don't agree with either one of those. I don't think Bathsheba was seducing David. I think she was doing she was on the roof. She was where she was supposed to be bathing. But I also don't think that she was completely innocent in the matter. I just don't think that she was the one that initiated it. So going on with this, David sends for her. Bathsheba comes. They lie together. It ends up Bathsheba's pregnant. So David's got to figure this out now. He calls for Uriah, who happens to be one of David's mighty men. So this guy who was with David from the beginning, like from David and Goliath times, very close to that. He sends for Uriah, tries to trick him into thinking that the child is his. And since Uriah is such an upright guy, it doesn't work. So David's like, well, gotta kill you now. Like that is straight where he goes to. This is such a fall from David and Goliath, the guy who's, you've defied the armies of the living God. This height of him promoting God and showing how show all the earth there's a God in Israel, and now he's just murdering some guy. Like, what a jump! Like, what a difference! So after Uriah is killed, and David calls Bathsheba to him, and they end up being married. The prophet Nathan shows up. The prophet Nathan is one of my favorite characters in the Old Testament because he is just the epitome of, like, if you're watching a children's TV and then they're doing something wrong, and the adult comes in at the end of the show and tells you the lesson that you should learn. That is Nathan. Nathan is the guy who is always there when he's like, no, David, you're wrong. Like, David, you messed up. David actually names one of his sons Nathan. I don't know if you know that, but David had so much respect for this man, for being the guy who called him out, that he named his son Nathan. Like, I just think that's such an interesting relationship that they had. Well, Nathan is just a master teacher here because he pulls at David's heartstrings. If you remember, David had to tend his father's sheep. David is a shepherd at heart. So Nathan, when he needs to show David the wrong, what does he do? He talks about sheep. And Nathan gives this story about, and this is in chapter 12, one man who has this sheep that he loves, that he keeps in his own house because he loves this one sheep so much. And then this other man who has hundreds of sheep. When a friend comes to town, he steals the one man's sheep and slaughters it to impress his friend. And David is furious. The old shepherd is coming out on him. He's furious. He's so mad. He's like, the man shall repay it tenfold, and then that man's going to die. That man deserves death. And then a very famous passage, Nathan says, David, you are the man. Starting in verse 7 of chapter 12. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel and delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your keeping, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. If that had been too little, I would have given you much more. Why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You have killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart your house, because you have despised me, and you have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up an adversary against you from your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun. So David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has also put away your sin. You shall not die. That sounds like the end of it, right? Nathan being like, okay, this is the punishment. David said, I've sinned. And Nathan says, the Lord has put away your sin. Like, that sounds like the end of it. But Nathan just hits him with the punchline right here. Now, everything David did was wrong, and Nathan calls him out on all of it. But the punchline here, the real kicker is what Nathan says is verse 14. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also who was born to you shall surely die. Then Nathan departed to his house. What's the worst thing that David did? To Nathan. According to Nathan, what's the worst thing that David did? Is it adultery? Was it the lying? We know God hates a liar. We know that God set up marriage. Is it murder? That's a big one. That's one of the first commandments God gives is to Noah. He says, you shall eat meat, but do not kill man, for man is made in the image of God. It's blasphemy. That is the worst sin to Nathan. Nathan explains to him, the worst thing you did out of everything is you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. I was reading through 2 Samuel, and I read that, and I was like, that sounds familiar. Because why was David mad at Goliath? Because he was an enemy of the Lord who was blaspheming. David slayed Goliath. David killed Goliath. Because he was defying the armies of the living God. The motivation that David had for his greatest achievement was, who is this uncircumcised Philistine who we're allowing to blaspheme the living God? He even tells Goliath, I'm going to kill you so that the earth will know that there is a God in Israel. He's doing it to glorify God, to put down the blasphemer. David and Bathsheba, what's the worst thing he did? He allowed great opportunity for the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. Okay, so I don't think any of us are going to kill a giant or do everything that David did with Bathsheba and killing Uriah. That's like a TNT TV show episode. But this lives in our life too. These ideas, especially since we are Christians. Christian literally means follower of Christ. I wish I would have thought of this sooner because I would have pulled up the verse. But when a high priest went before God on the Day of Atonement, he wore white linen. And it was to show that he was a servant. He was representing all of Israel before God. He wore white linen. When the high priest went before the people of Israel on the Day of Atonement, that guy was decked out. He had a golden turban. He had the ephod with the stones and the gold. He had all these different ornaments that he wore to show glory. It's because he was to represent God before the people. So this high priest had this duty of representing people before God, but also representing God before people. Brothers and sisters, if you read 1 Peter chapter 2, it makes it quite clear that we're the priests now. For you are a royal nation, or a holy nation, a royal priesthood. We are the priests. We're the ones who are supposed to represent God to the people. We're made in God's image. We're the ones that when someone sees you, they're supposed to see the attributes of God. I really like the idea that a preacher told me one time that when God, or Jesus tells us that we are the lights of the earth, we're not the sun, we're the moon. It's not our light that we're showing. We don't produce the light, but we're reflecting the glory of God. That's the light that we're showing. So remembering the question that I asked at the beginning, why is it such a big deal when those of us who have accepted Christ, when those of us who know better, sin publicly? Okay, let me define some terms real quick, and then I promise I'll use a New Testament verse to make this a little bit more of a biblical sermon. When I say public sin, most of us who grew up in the church, what you think of right then, at least what I do, is the invitation, right? Because those are the two things that I'm invited in the invitations. You want to get baptized, or you sin. If you've sinned in a public manner, and you need to make it right publicly. You hear that phrase a lot. And growing up, and some of y'all may be on the same ideas that I am, when I hear sin publicly, what I think is like you got caught in adultery, or like you've done something terrible that like the police have been involved in and it's on the news. Those are extreme versions, and those are true versions of public sin. But that's not just what public sin is. One of the most obvious ones, and I think the ones that Christians fall for a lot, is being hateful. It's very, very hard to be a hateful person secretly. And like, well, we can take the extreme of hateful people, so you're just backbiting and you never have a kind word to say to anyone. Let me give you a very real world example. Have you ever chewed out a waiter or waitress at a restaurant because your deal was a little wrong? That's kind of hateful. Now, of course, there's a way of going about, you shouldn't just like roll over. Like there's a way of going about making that right in a kind way. Or what if you're just like an absolute liar? And I don't mean like you're really good at it. No one knows you're a liar. Because eventually, if you're a true liar, people will figure it out. What if I know that I just can't trust a word coming out of your mouth? When he tells me that, or when she tells me that, I almost believe the opposite. There's so many different sins you can attach this to. It's not just the major sins that are public. It's something that affects your reputation. How do I show the glory of God when I act like that? To give you a very specific reason why this is terrible, it's not just the glorify God thing. Let's say that let's use that hateful person example. People know that I'm just looking for a fight. I love chewing out waiters and waitresses at restaurants. If you give me 10 minutes, I'll complain about what's wrong with the world today, which I hate that phrase, by the way. You know what's wrong with the world today? Yes, sin. Have you read the Bible? What's wrong with this next generation? What's wrong with the older generation? What's wrong with everything else I can see? What's wrong with everybody except for me? I just made a poem there and I didn't even mean to, but that's the idea. If I'm that type of person and then I meet someone who knows that reputation about me and I'm like, well, have you heard about God? Let me read 1 John to you. God is love. There is none who can come to the Father who do not know love. You cannot say, I hate my brother and love God, for God is love. No one has loved his brother who does not know God. What example am I showing there? Okay, this hateful person is trying to tell me about the God of love. Well, what does he know about love? Or you're just an absolute liar. No one can trust you with the truth. Or you're a gossip or whatever it is. Well, okay, were you telling me that the Lord is truth, that God himself defines truth, and if you love God, you must love the truth? I don't think you've ever told the truth a day in your life. Why would I listen to you about God? Okay, turn to 1 Peter with me. This is where I want to bring out a verse here. 1 Peter chapter 2. And I think this verse is a little bit more pungent if you know the context. So 1 Peter was written to the Christians who've been kicked out of Rome. This is right after the burning of Rome. Rome needed someone to blame. They blamed the Christians. They've been kicked out. They've been very violently persecuted, more than just evicted from their houses. But they can't live in their homes anymore because Rome doesn't want them. That's why Peter addresses this to the pilgrims of the dispersion. He's saying to those of you who've been kicked out of your homes and are being persecuted. I think a lot of us are ready for persecution in a wrong way. We've been promised persecution. That is a very solid promise we've been given, that if we are following Christ, we will be persecuted. It's even given as kind of like a checkpoint. If you're not being persecuted, you're probably not following God. But I think what a lot of us do is we take persecution in a rebellious way. Like, oh yeah, I'm ready to be persecuted. And you're like, I'm going to get reviled. And then you don't revile to their face. When that person persecutes you, you hold it in. But when you get home, you start reviling them as much as you can. Well, look at this. Look at this. I can't think of a word that I can say in front of the kids. Look at this meanie for persecuting me. Like, we think of all these reviles. We go, oh, I didn't revile him to his face. He doesn't know any better. That's not any better. Or the people who are like, I'll go straight to jail when they make Christianity illegal. I think that's a good thing, that you have that faith until death. But are you doing that for the right reasons? Are you doing that in a way that's like, you just kind of want to stick it to the man and be rebellious in your Christianity? Or are you doing it because of your faith? And really where I'm trying to boil down to is what Peter tells these people who are in the persecution in this letter is in verse 11. This is kind of the summation of this epistle if you needed one. Verse 11 says, Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. That is such an interesting idea. How do I make it so that not only am I glorifying God, but I can make the uncircumcised Philistine glorify God in the day of visitation? The evildoers of this world. What are the two things Peter tells us to do that we make it that the evildoers glorify God? The first one's obvious. Abstain from fleshly lusts. Okay. Don't sin. It's pretty straightforward. What I love, and the one that I really want to point out, your conduct honorable among the Gentiles? How do I make it that Goliath from Gath knows that there's a God in Israel? How do I make it so that those who are outside the church, who persecute me, who are evildoers, will glorify God in the day of visitation? Behave. Behave. Like, I feel like when I was writing this sermon, I felt like this was such a big build up to like such a like, I feel like I'm a mom in front of my little kids yelling at them right now. What do you want to do? Do you want to not provide opportunity or great occasion for the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme? Do I want to make it so that the Philistines know, or all the earth know, that there's a God in Israel? Okay, yeah. Do I go and slay Goliath? No. Peter just tells me, behave. Have your conduct honorable among the Gentiles. And the Gentiles here, not meaning non-Jews, it means those not in the church. Those who are not in the kingdom of God. Because if I'm rude, like not even sinfully hateful, just plain rude, that reflects on God. If someone looks at me and I'm claiming to be a Christian, I'm claiming to be someone who represents God, and I'm just not a nice person, well, that gives great occasion for the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. It's so easy for hypocrites to tear down the church. It's something that my friend Alexander Newman said that I have repeated several times. But hateful Christians have done more damage to the church than atheists ever will. If I'm someone inside the church, I'm claiming to be a Christian, I'm coming to church every Sunday, I put a pretty decently sized check in the plate, I know that the Lord's Supper, the bread should be on the right and the juice on the left. I just made that up. I have no idea what you'll have. Whatever it is, I got all the details down right. But I don't have my conduct honorable among the Gentiles. Then I'm giving great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. I'll leave you with this, because this is the character in the Bible. I know we talked about David, but this is the man in the Bible who I think greatly reflects this idea, is Daniel. If you need someone, if you're looking or listening to the sermon and you're like, oh, that's something I should think on more, think about Daniel. Because literally it says that Daniel was honored by both God and man. Like chapter 1, it says that, I believe. The idea that Daniel is in Babylon. Daniel is having to do things that he's like, well, is this a tradition or is this against law? And Daniel is constantly having to balance the idea of giving up things that I'm comfortable with, but abstaining from things that are sinful. Where's that line? And I need to make sure that I'm okay doing what the Lord needs me to do. Daniel walks that line perfectly. Daniel has his honor, or is honored by both God and man. He has his conduct honorable among the Gentiles. So, I'm betting y'all have never heard a sermon before about David and Goliath that ends with me telling y'all to behave. So you put that one down in your history books. Thank you for your kind attention.